So we are looking at how did alchemy work with Esoterica as a big Full Metal Alchemist head. You know, interested, always interested in hearing a little more about, I guess the background of alchemy. But yeah.
A particle accelerator at CERN recently achieved the dream of the alchemists. They transmuted lead into gold, firing lead atoms at one another and just so slightly missing, these interactions created a high
Pulling up
energy
my
pulse.
notes.
And that pulse caused three protons to be ejected from some of the lead atoms, thus creating gold. Of course, the energy required was very costly. They only produced about 29 trillionths of a gram of gold, and it vanished in a fraction of a second. But hey, counts, right? Of course, nuclear transmutation had already been achieved. 1941 saw
Yep.
mercury, and then 1980 saw both bismuth transmuted into gold. But tales of the transmutation of base metals into gold and silver are as old as alchemy itself. But given that chemical transmutation is now known to be impossible, what exactly was going on in the labs and in the crucibles of those hermetically sealed vessels? Let's explore the possibilities and discover how real historical alchemy might have worked. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence backed, free, and accessible content on topics like these, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or some of the cool merch we have on the channel, some of which is alchemy themed. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land with reliable information, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in historical books, actual historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out our bookstore over at Esoterica Rare Occult Books. You can find all of those links over in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now let's step back into the labs of those ancient alchemists and discover what might have been going on in these tales of transmutation. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
Right, off to a great start.
One of the most ancient goals of alchemy was the transformation of one substance, specifically a base metal like lead or tin, into a noble substance, a metal like silver or gold. And this began all the way back at the origin of alchemy with Greco Egyptian alchemists who were able to carefully control the tinging or coloring of metals, giving them a silver, gold, red, or other color luster. The reasoning went that if they could transform the surface of these metals, then there must be some process by which they could transform the metal all the way through, transmutation of one metal to another. And some of our earliest alchemical recipes describe such practical and theoretical processes. Now, I've done a whole video on Greco-Egyptian alchemy, and along with the most famous of those alchemists, Zosimos of Panopolis, if you want to check that out. But the most important theoretical shift in alchemical history happened in the Abbasid Caliphate in Iraq, where the school of Jabir ibn Hayyan developed what is called the mercury-sulfur theory of the metals. Building on Aristotle's more ancient theory that the metals were formed by gaseous exhalations deep within the earth, these ingenious Arabic alchemists argued that those exhalations were actually composed of two specific substances, mercury and sulfur, the ratio of which, when fused, became the various metals as we know them. Thus, it should be theoretically possible, they reasoned, to decompose any metal into their basic sulfur and mercury components and by art or artifice recompose them into other metals. And this theory also has straightforward empirical confirmation as well. The most common form of lead to occur in nature is the mineral galena, which I have some right here, or lead sulfide. But to extract the elemental lead, one need only basically roast that galena in a common hearth fire. What would have been obvious to the experimental alchemist would have been the smell, As it heats up, it gives off the telltale odor of sulfur. Galena is sulfide, lead sulfide after all, with the liquid lead looking very much like mercury before being quenched in water and thus fixed, to use the alchemical language, as lead. And keep in mind, galena, that's going to matter a lot in just a moment. But despite developing a range of new technologies and techniques, including a range of furnaces, labware, and chemical processes such as sublimation and distillation, along with a range of powerful novel chemicals such as acids, the alchemists were never able to produce more gold or silver than originally went into their crucibles. Of course, we now know this is a law of conservation, but they didn't. And many honest alchemists, such as the occultist Cornelius Agrippa, actually admitted as much. They could never seem to produce more gold and silver than went into the hermetically sealed crucibles. And the reason for this is just now known. Chemical transmutation is simply impossible. Now, I know what some of you are thinking out there. That's because they were never trying to transform metals at all. Alchemy was always really about spiritual or inner psychological transformation. And while this is admittedly a very lovely idea and a wonderful modern interpretation of alchemy,
And that is pretty much Full Metal Alchemist in a nutshell. But yeah, definitely so far it's only interesting seeing how pre-modern understandings of the world, despite being ultimately incorrect according to science, were very rigorously defined and thought through systems. I mean, it reminds me a lot of the video we just watched about anti portals, which those are things as far as we know do not exist in the real world yet. In the world of computer graphical representation, we can do all these incredibly interesting and complicated mathematical manipulations and whatnot. And honestly, it's making me think it'd be very, very interesting to have an alchemy themed game that basically runs on the rules of alchemy. Which, I'm sure something like that probably does exist, but let me know, I guess.
it's not at all historically accurate. The concept of spiritual or psychological alchemy, as most people know it, was primarily developed in the 19th and 20th centuries by occultists
Carl
like
Jung.
Mary Ann Atwood or the psychoanalyst and genius Carl Jung. Now, if you're interested in the history of actual spiritual alchemy, especially its European origins among late 17th century mystical heterodox Protestants, check out my ongoing series on just that topic. But suffice to say, historical alchemy was in fact concerned with actually transforming metals with the famed Philosopher's Stone, but also developing a range of other technologies like life extending medicines and solvents, including the most famous solvent of all, the alkahest, the universal solvent, which had the attendant problem of if it's a universal solvent, what exactly do you store it in? But
Right.
despite the impossibility of chemical transmutation, dozens of such transmutation tales abound in alchemical literature. Some texts even provide detailed to a point instructions for the production of the famed Philosopher's Stone, which is said to have had the power to do that very transmutation. And I say detailed up to a point because even the most sober alchemical texts, which describe alchemical procedures, some of which, by the way, are so clear that modern forensic chemists like the pioneering scholars Newman and Principe have actually recreated historical alchemical procedures in modern labs. But even those most detailed protocols inevitably become as vague as they are grandiose, such that basically there's kind of a bit of hand waving and a miracle happens, and gold or silver is seemingly appearing in the crucible and then is multiplied in volume. Now, if you're interested in the topic of the Philosopher's Stone itself, you can also, again, check out my deep dive on that topic as well, along with a pretty big playlist I have on topics in alchemy here on the channel. But what gives? If chemical transmutation is in fact impossible, and it is, and yet we have not only transmutation tales, but literal surviving artifacts said to have been made of alchemical gold, what was actually going on in the labs and the crucibles of the alchemists. And speaking of alchemical crucibles, this is an alchemical crucible sitting here on the set of Esoterica. Part of that might be to unravel that mystery, might be actually getting these 17th century alchemical Hessian crucibles tested. These are, in fact, known, as I said, Hessian crucibles, and they're nested together. And I'm hoping to get this one tested to see what's actually in here and what was the alchemist doing when they were working on this. So stay tuned for that. Should I be touching this and putting it so close to my face with all the
No,
mercury?
probably not.
Put this over here. But awaiting that, let's explore some possibilities behind what have been going on in these tales of transmutation. The first possibility is perhaps the most human: fraud. Alchemical fraud is attested at the very beginning of alchemy. Zosimus, the Egyptian alchemist, complains about frauds in his day and was an enduring problem through the entire history of the great hermetic art of alchemy. In fact, early modern monarchs and aristocrats even had wonderfully
Man, definitely. Whoever put together this illustration must have had a bone to pick with alchemists, literally depicting them as monkeys at typewriters before, presumably before the invention of typewriters.
and was an enduring problem through the entire history of the great hermetic art of alchemy. In fact, early modern monarchs and aristocrats even had wonderfully horrible methods of punishment for alchemical frauds. And perhaps the most famous case of fraud was that of Georg Hanauer, who promised Duke Friedrich of Württemberg that he would produce for him 25 metric centners of gold from iron. Now, the Duke was a bit wary of such a grandiose claim, and therefore he carefully sequestered the alchemist in his lab for this transmutation trial run. Do a little first to prove you can do it, and then you can have all 25 centners. But he didn't actually search the lab as carefully as he should have, because Honauer's child apprentice was actually hiding in a box in the lab. And during the transmutation trial run, he snuck out of the chest and put a bit of gold into the hermetically sealed vessel. Hermetically sealed. And of course, the Duke eventually found out about this, and for his trouble, Hanauer was strung up on a gibbet made of 25 metric centners of iron covered in gold leaf. A lesson for the, I don't know, alchemical betrugers, the alchemical frauds out there. But I really do
Bro, they
appreciate
did
this
not play
kind
back
of
then.
early modern poetic justice, literally being strung up on the very iron you were meant to transmute, falsely covered in gold leaf. It's really an art form all itself, medieval torture. All right, aside from fraud, many of the most common transmutation tales involve taking a pre-existing metallic substance, and often through the application of some transmutation element, like that mysterious red power that Edward Kelly was said to have had, to reduce the volume of that substance such that a precious metal remains or a transmuting compound is produced, which can be used to make more gold or silver later on. This transmutation via reduction probably has its origins in the process that we now know as cupellation, whereby a volume of ore is superheated such that some of it vaporizes, leaving behind heavier metals, specifically gold and silver. Now, recall that ore, galena, that I have here? That's iron sulfide that I mentioned a moment ago. Well, galena also contains often a little bit of silver along with the lead that it is. Assayas, an alchemist, had discovered that with very
You say iron sulfide?
that I mentioned a moment ago. Or galena that I have here, that's iron sulfide that I mentioned a moment ago.
Caught a bit of an
galena
error
also
there.
contains often a little bit of silver along with the lead that it is. Assayas, an alchemist, had discovered that with very powerful custom-built furnaces, you could melt the lead, but also eventually vaporize the lead using those furnaces, and it would leave behind, in some cases, a small bead of silver, seeming.
I'm sure the resulting lead vapors were very, very healthy and good for the body of these alchemists and their minds.
Transmuting the lead into silver. Well, you're halfway there. There must be a way of making it into gold. Another famous process actually involved using silver coins, specifically Brabant thalers, along with various sands as a kind of flux, such that the silver could be poured off, leaving behind a small bead of pure gold. Now, of course, we now know that Brabant thalers are actually known to contain a very small amount of gold, and some examples, which I have a few, actually contain a small amount of gold, and there's even a bit of a yellow sheen to them in the right light. And such processes using a range of metals, including lead and copper, are well documented by luminary alchemists such as Libavius and Cyndavigius. But if not by reduction, another way to produce noble metals was through fusing those metals with other substances to create more of the precious metals in that process, which is a process the alchemists typically referred to as multiplication. Such processes are actually known as far back as ancient Egyptian texts like the Leiden and Stockholm papyri, among our earliest alchemical manuscripts known. Now, this typically involved taking some amount of pure gold or silver and then infusing the metal with additional substances. Often copper and zinc are in the case of gold, or tin and arsenic in the case of silver, often along with a substrate of liquid mercury in various forms. Now, the problem here should be relatively obvious. The increase in the of apparent volume of the precious metals comes at the cost of their debasement. And if we investigate some of the few remaining examples of the alchemical gold produced in the early modern period, that's exactly what we find. Yes, some alchemical gold has survived down to this day. The famed medallion produced by the alchemist Winslow Sailor, actually produced for Leopold I, was produced from apparently transmuting silver into gold by dipping the medallion in a mysterious transmutation liquid. Studying the medallion in the 20th century, we discovered that it's composed primarily of about 48% gold, 43% silver, about 7.9% copper, along with traces of tin, zinc, and iron. Now, what was that mysterious transmutation liquid? It was probably diluted nitric acid, which attacked every other chemical in the medallion except for the gold, thus leaving behind an apparent solid gold medallion sufficient to pass at least some of the classic methods of precious metal assay. So this one's a little alchemy and a little fraud.
Right.
So fun. Another process for producing precious metals through the process of what the alchemists called cementation, whereby layers of metals were joined together, often compiled into strips before being fused together through a process which transformed the metal into an alleged precious metal. Described by Cyndavigius and many other alchemists, thin layers of gold would be carefully layered over other metals and then heated to fuse them, often with special alchemical salts or other transmutation substances put into there with the precious metal. Now, this process was rather interesting for technical reasons at least, and then that precise temperature control was often required, such that the metals wouldn't totally fuse, becoming an obvious alloy. Rather, the silver or gold surface had to be fused by heat welding without totally melting it into an alloy. Now, of course, this could be easily detected simply by cutting into the alchemical gold or silver, something we find essayists doing. However, another process involving lead sheets fused with silver creating gold was also known. But the presence of the gold in the alchemical process was actually, again, probably just through cupellation. You would fuse it at a high temperature and it would leave behind a bit of gold or silver. But again, this is actually the process of cupellation that I just described a moment ago, often with those secret alchemical transmutation elements often acting as salts, which basically formed a flux by which the gold or silver could run out. Further, various metals could also be tinged or colored using precious metals as a kind of plating. In fact, this tinging or coloring of metals in ancient Egypt using a device known as the karatakis was actually the foundation of Western alchemy itself. Thus, many such procedures are known through the history of alchemy. And in most cases, gold was attacked with acids and mercury along with other substances so as to produce a kind of gold amalgam, which could then be applied.
I was not aware that there's apparently a an issue of our day where like the people basically take tungsten ingots and then like gold plate them. Yeah. Interesting.
To the surface of something like silver, which was then heated and washed, leaving behind a gold layer, thus transmuting the silver. For what it's worth, the process of dissolving gold or making potable gold explains some of the most powerful imagery that you may recognize from the history of alchemy. The dissolving of gold, often with a bit of copper impurity and aqua regia, or concentrated nitric acid and hydrochloric acid in about a 1:3 ratio, produces a very distinct green hue before a dramatic red color appears. and the ability of aqua regia to attack gold was captured in the famous image of the green lion eating the sun with the blood pouring out. Further, the famed Philosopher's Stone and other transmutation elements like Edward Kelly's famed powder was often depicted as being bright red, the very color of gold so dissolved. And you can check out a great many videos on YouTube where this process is actually performed using fuming nitric acid or aqua regia from people recovering gold from, say, old electronic components. These people are the alchemists of our days. Various protocols
Sure.
also exist in the history of alchemy for producing metals with the appearance of gold or silver from non-precious metals. And again, many of these recipes go all the way back to the very dawn of alchemy itself. Gold could be produced from iron pyrite, rightly called fool's gold, fused with copper and polished. Silver was often produced with a combination of lead, tin, and mercury by various means. The preparation of brass was also associated with production of gold, often through various admixtures, specifically involving sulfur and mercury, unsurprisingly knowing how alchemy theoretically worked in the mind of the alchemists. In fact, one such procedure involved the distillation of cinnabar for producing liquid mercury, cinnabar, which also produced things like sulfuric acid, which in turn was distilled with alum and sal ammoniac, which actually produced aqua regia, the very substance that they would need to attack gold. Thus, in the process of creating such tinging techniques, especially with the use of mercury, etc., many of these became the backbone of industrial chemistry. So they didn't transmute gold or silver, but they did produce the foundations of chemical modernity. And that's a point that shouldn't be missed. Part of the danger of the idea that it was just all spiritual leads one into a kind of historical blind alley. If all of what the alchemists were doing was psychological or spiritual, how in the world did modern chemistry emerge at all? And barring alchemists actually working in their labs to do these sadly impossible transmutations, these secondary technologies and productions and techniques could have never been produced, and thus chemistry would just have had to have emerged out of whole cloth in the late 18th century, a notion that clearly makes no sense. Now, of course, did the alchemists think of what they were doing as spiritual in some sense? Well, of course they did, because they were living in an extremely Christian area, and almost every craft and every trade was imbued with both religious and spiritual mythology and symbolism. But we shouldn't confuse symbolism and metaphor for what they were really doing, which was laboratory work. Of course, as I mentioned, historical texts of alchemy often began to border on the fantastical as they approached the production of the Philosopher's Stone or the generation of gold and silver, and this will sometimes involve bizarre substances like dried basilisk, don't look at that, or just, directly invoking divine agency to aid with the transmutation in the case of people like John Rupsisha. Regardless, what I think is crucially important in appreciating the work of the alchemist is not in denigrating their lack of possible success in transmutation, nor romanticizing, spiritualizing, or otherwise psychologizing their efforts, but in deeply understanding how they understood their work and how they went about their work, how they understood nature and attempted to transform it, thus becoming the shoulders upon which the genius of modern chemistry in fact stands, and the genius of modern interpretations of alchemy as fundamentally spiritual or otherwise psychological. While transmutation had to wait for high-energy nuclear chemistry to fulfill the dreams of the alchemists, we can still marvel at their deep commitment to innovation, experimentalism, daring, and their awe of nature. Traits I think are just good for any modern person or scientist. Now, I have lots of content here on the channel on the history of alchemy if you want to check those out. I've also included a historically reliable book list on alchemy in the description if you want to check out those for a much deeper dive on the actual historical realities of alchemy. As many of you know, alchemy was my first esoteric love, so there's going to be a lot more content like this on alchemy in the future. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, religion, and apparently science.
All right. Lovely video. Definitely would recommend checking this guy out. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna be looking through his filmography, looking for more more content from him. But yeah, some of the notes I guess I pulled out or wrote down I guess while looking at this. I mean, definitely found it interesting how the alchemists of the past would they would use these sort of natural processes like the distillation process as proof for the uh, success of alchemy. It was a little reminiscent of how conspiracy theorists and other similar I guess like quote unquote internally consistent thought processes continually sort of prove themselves no matter what no matter what evidence is thrown their way. But ultimately, it is like Mr. Esoterica said. These sort of branches of natural philosophy were what eventually gave way to science. It's a little ahistorical and kind of arrogant to treat these I guess ancient peoples like they were just dullards who were too dumb to figure out. Well, I mean, like part of the reason we even know what we know is because of the efforts these people made. You describe that middle way of not trying to do perennialism with them, where it's like, oh, they're they're all this, like I said, not psychologizing their efforts, but not also belittling them either. Just recognizing them for what they were, just humans trying to understand shit, same as there ever was. But yeah, but speaking of his first esoteric love, and it sort of reminded me of mine, which were pretty much cryptids, Mothman, Jersey Devil type stuff. Loved that stuff as a kid, even though it scared the hell out of me. Or maybe it's more accurate to say I loved it because it scared the hell out of me. But yeah. Thanks so much for watching. Consider liking, commenting, maybe even subscribing. And if you're feeling particularly generous and of age in your country of residence, try visiting these links up in the corner. Anyway, here are some more videos to check out, and until next time, take care.